It is a peculiar thing, growing old alongside one's memories. I sit now in a chair that has moulded itself, over years of faithful service, to the particular curvature of my spine, and I find that my recollections have done much the same, shaped themselves around the man I have become, softened in some places, sharpened in others, until I can no longer be entirely certain where the truth ends and the telling begins. But there is one case, among all the strange and sometimes terrible affairs in which I accompanied Sherlock Holmes, that I have never written down. Not because I forgot it. I have not forgotten a single detail. I did not write it because for a very long time I did not know how to. The facts were clear enough. Holmes had solved it with his customary precision, and the guilty party had been identified beyond any reasonable dispute. Yet when it was over, I did not feel the satisfaction that usually accompanied the closing of a difficult case. I felt, instead, a kind of quiet grief, the sort one experiences not at a funeral, but weeks afterward, when one reaches for the telephone and remembers there is no one on the other end. I have decided at last to set it down. Not because the world needs another tale of Sherlock Holmes, but because the world perhaps needs to understand what it costs a man to discover something true about himself, and to live with that discovery ever after. It was the autumn of 1896, and London had settled into that particular melancholy which descends upon the city when the last of the summer light retreats behind the rooftops and the fog begins its slow annual siege. I had been staying at Baker Street for nearly a fortnight, my wife having gone to visit her sister in the country, and I had fallen back into the old rhythms with an ease that both comforted and unsettled me. Holmes had been in one of his darker moods for much of that period, not the manic restlessness that preceded a case, but the deeper, more philosophical torpor that sometimes overtook him when the world failed to provide sufficient stimulation. He had spent 3 days conducting a series of chemical experiments involving the decomposition rates of various organic fibers, the results of which he recorded in a battered notebook with an intensity that suggested he believed the fate of nations hung upon the tensile strength of hemp rope. I had learned, long ago, not to interrupt these periods. One simply waited, as one waits out weather. The change came on a Thursday morning. I remember this because Mrs. Hudson had brought up kippers, which she reserved exclusively for Thursdays, and Holmes had not touched his plate, a fact unremarkable in itself, as Holmes's relationship with food was, at best, adversarial. But he had set aside his notebook, and he was reading a letter, not scanning it, as he often did, with that rapid flicker of the eyes that could consume a page in seconds, but reading it slowly, his lips pressed together, his brow drawn into a single vertical furrow between his eyes. I watched him over the edge of my newspaper and said nothing. After perhaps 5 minutes, he set the letter down on the table beside his untouched kippers and stared at the wall. "Watson," he said, in the tone of a man who has been addressed by someone he cannot see, "have you ever considered the possibility that a man might commit a crime not out of malice, nor greed, nor passion, but out of a desperate and ultimately futile desire to remain the person he believes himself to be?" I lowered my paper. "I should think that describes a great many criminals, Holmes. Most men who do terrible things convince themselves they had no choice." "No," he said, and there was an unusual precision in the word, as though he were correcting not my logic but my understanding. "I do not mean self-justification. I mean something more fundamental. I mean a man who discovers that everything he has built his life upon, his identity, his purpose, his very sense of himself as a moral being, rests upon a single assumption, and when that assumption is threatened, he does not merely defend it, he kills to preserve it, not out of cruelty, out of terror." He handed me the letter. It was written on heavy cream paper, the kind favoured by solicitors and men of established means, and the handwriting was neat, precise, and remarkably steady for a document whose contents were, as I quickly discovered, anything but calm. It was from a Mr. Arthur Denniston of Denniston, Price and Callaway Solicitors, with offices in Lincoln's Inn Fields. He wrote on behalf of a client whom he did not name, requesting the immediate and confidential assistance of Mr. Sherlock Holmes in a matter involving what he described, with lawyerly circumspection, as a death whose circumstances have raised questions that the official investigation has thus far failed to address. The deceased was one Professor Edwin Hartley, late of King's College, a man of considerable academic reputation, who had been found dead in his study on the evening of October the 7th. The coroner had ruled the death a suicide. Professor Hartley had been discovered with a single gunshot wound to the right temple, a revolver in his hand, and no signs of forced entry or struggle. But Mr. Denniston's unnamed client believed, with what the solicitor described as a conviction bordering on certainty, that Professor Hartley had been murdered. "The police are satisfied," Holmes remarked, watching me as I read. "The coroner is satisfied. The newspapers have printed their brief, respectful obituaries and moved on. A distinguished academic, overworked and melancholic, takes his own life. It is a story the world finds easy to believe because the world has heard it many times before." "And you?" I asked. "Are you satisfied?" Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window, where he stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the grey street below. The fog was thickening, as it often did in the late morning, and the passing carriages had begun to take on the quality of shadows, shapes without substance, moving through a world rendered soft and uncertain. "I am never satisfied, Watson. That is both my gift and my affliction. But in this instance, I confess that the letter itself interests me less than what it does not say. Mr. Denniston is a senior partner in a well-regarded firm. He does not write to consulting detectives on a whim. His unnamed client is someone of sufficient importance that Denniston feels the need to act as intermediary rather than allow direct contact. And the word he uses, conviction bordering on certainty, is carefully chosen. It is the language of a man who has been told something he does not entirely believe, but cannot bring himself to dismiss." "You intend to take the case, then?" "I intend to meet Mr. Denniston at 11:30. I sent a wire an hour ago. You will come, of course." It was not a question, and I did not treat it as one. I set aside my newspaper, finished my tea, and went to fetch my coat. The offices of Denniston, Price and Callaway occupied the upper 2 floors of a handsome Georgian building in Lincoln's Inn Fields, the kind of address that speaks quietly but unmistakably of old money and established reputation. We were shown into a waiting room panelled in dark oak, where a portrait of the firm's founder, a stern, whiskered gentleman who appeared to regard the viewer with a mixture of contempt and indigestion, gazed down from above the mantelpiece. A clerk brought us tea in china cups so thin I could see the shadow of my own fingers through the porcelain. Arthur Denniston emerged after a brief wait. He was a man of perhaps 60, with the kind of face that age had refined rather than eroded, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that were both intelligent and careful. He shook our hands with the measured warmth of a man accustomed to managing the expectations of others, and led us into his private office, a large room dominated by a mahogany desk and several bookcases filled with legal volumes whose spines suggested they were consulted frequently rather than displayed for effect. "Gentlemen," he said, settling into his chair with the practiced ease of a man who spent the majority of his waking hours behind a desk, "I appreciate your promptness. Before we proceed, I must ask for your assurance of absolute discretion. My client's identity is known to very few, and she wishes it to remain so." "She," Holmes said, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible shift in his posture, a slight forward inclination, like a hound catching a scent. Denniston permitted himself a thin smile. "You are as observant as your reputation suggests, Mr. Holmes?" "Yes, my client is Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, the widow of the deceased." "The widow believes her husband was murdered," Holmes said, "yet she does not wish to be publicly associated with this belief, which suggests that either the identity of the person she suspects would cause her considerable social difficulty, or that the reason she believes it was murder is something she is not prepared to reveal to the police." Denniston's smile faded. He regarded Holmes for a long moment, and I saw in his eyes the particular expression of a man who has just realized he is dealing with someone whose intelligence is not merely impressive but slightly unnerving. "Both," he said quietly. "It is both." He opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a slim leather folder, which he placed on the desk between us. Professor Hartley was, as you may know, one of the foremost authorities on classical antiquities in this country. He held the Regius Chair of Ancient History at King's College and was widely regarded as a man of impeccable character and rigorous intellect. He was 63 years old, in good health, and by all outward appearances content in both his professional and personal life. He and Mrs. Hartley had been married for 31 years. They had no children. "The absence of children," Holmes murmured. "Was this by choice?" Denniston hesitated. "I am not privy to the details of their private arrangements, Mr. Holmes, but I can tell you that Mrs. Hartley has described their marriage as, and I use her precise words, a partnership of deep mutual respect and quiet devotion. She is not a woman given to exaggeration. And yet she believes her devoted husband was killed," Holmes said. "By whom?" "By his protégé, a young man named Dr. Marcus Aylward." The name meant nothing to me at the time, though I would later learn that Dr. Aylward was something of a rising star in the academic world. A brilliant scholar of barely 30 who had attached himself to Professor Hartley's department some 4 years earlier and had rapidly become the older man's most trusted colleague, and by many accounts, his intellectual heir. Denniston provided us with the essentials. Aylward had been the last person known to have visited Hartley on the evening of his death. He had arrived at the Hartley residence in Bloomsbury at approximately 7 o'clock and had been shown to the professor's study by the housekeeper, a Mrs. Caldwell. Mrs. Hartley had been out that evening, attending a lecture at the British Museum. When she returned at 9:30, she found the study door locked from the inside. She called through the door. Receiving no answer, she sent Mrs. Caldwell for the police. When the door was forced open, Professor Hartley was found slumped in his chair, the revolver in his right hand, and the wound precisely where one would expect it in a case of self-inflicted death. "And Dr. Aylward?" Holmes asked. "Gone. The housekeeper states that she heard the front door close at approximately 8:15. She assumed Dr. Aylward had let himself out. He has confirmed this account. He says he left the professor alive and well, and that their conversation had been entirely routine, a discussion of a forthcoming publication." "The door was locked from the inside," I said. "That would seem to support the suicide finding rather decisively." Holmes glanced at me with the expression he reserved for moments when I had stated something that was simultaneously obvious and beside the point. "A locked door, Watson, is a fact. What it supports depends entirely on how one reads it. A door locked from the inside may indicate that the occupant wished to be alone with his final act. Or it may indicate that someone wished very much for the world to believe exactly that." Denniston nodded. "That is precisely Mrs. Hartley's position. She does not believe her husband locked that door. She says, and again, I relay her words, that in 31 years of marriage, he never once locked the door of his study. He regarded it as a point of principle. His work, he said, should have nothing to hide." There was a silence in the room, and I became aware of the ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece, a steady, patient sound that seemed to measure not merely seconds, but the weight of what had been said. "There is more," Denniston continued, and for the first time I detected a note of discomfort in his voice, the faintest tremor quickly mastered, but present nonetheless. "Mrs. Hartley has provided me with something that she found among her husband's papers after his death. She discovered it in a locked drawer of his desk, a drawer for which she had to obtain a key from his college office, as the professor kept it on his person at all times. She has asked me to show it to you, but I must warn you that its contents are of a deeply personal nature." He opened the leather folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper, folded once. He handed it to Holmes, who unfolded it and read it with that peculiar stillness that came over him when something genuinely surprised him. It was rare, that stillness. I had seen it perhaps half a dozen times in all our years together. He read the document once, then again, and then he handed it to me. It was a letter written in a hand I would later confirm as Professor Hartley's own, a cramped, scholarly script, the letters small and tightly formed, as though the writer begrudged each word the space it occupied on the page. It was dated 3 days before his death and addressed to no one. There was no salutation, no closing. It read, in its entirety, "I have lived my life as a lie, and I find that I can no longer bear the weight of it. For 40 years I have performed the role of a man I am not, and the performance has been so complete, so thorough, so damnably convincing, that there is no one left alive who knows the truth save one. That one person now threatens to unmake everything. Not through malice, I think, but through a kind of careless honesty that the young mistake for courage. I do not know what I will do. I know only that I cannot allow the truth to be spoken. Not because I am ashamed. I have been ashamed for so long that shame has become a kind of companion, familiar and almost dear, but because the truth would destroy not only me but the one person in this world whose good opinion I cannot afford to lose. I would rather die than see that happen. Perhaps I will." I read it twice and set it down. The room was very quiet. "You see the difficulty?" Denniston said. "If this letter were to be shown to the police, they would regard it as a suicide note. Mrs. Hartley does not. She believes it was written as a private confession, the kind of document a man writes to himself when he is trying to find a way forward. She points out that the final sentence, 'Perhaps I will,' is conditional, not resolved. A man who had decided to kill himself, she argues, would not write 'perhaps.'" "She is not wrong," Holmes said, "though she is not necessarily right either. The human mind is rarely so tidy in its intentions. What does Mrs. Hartley believe this letter refers to? What is the lie her husband claims to have lived?" Denniston placed his hands flat on the desk, a gesture I recognized as one of careful preparation, and he spoke with the deliberate precision of a man who has rehearsed difficult words. "Mrs. Hartley believes that her husband was in love with Dr. Marcus Aylward. She believes that this love was the central secret of her husband's life, and that Dr. Aylward either discovered this truth or had known it for some time, and that what happened in that study on the evening of October the 7th was a confrontation not about any publication, but about the nature of their relationship. She believes that Dr. Aylward killed her husband to protect his own reputation and career, and that he arranged the scene to appear as suicide. I confess that I did not know, in that moment, what to say. The world in which Holmes and I moved was not, of course, ignorant of such things. The trials of Oscar Wilde, only a year before, had laid bare the terrible machinery of public judgment that awaited any man whose private affections deviated from the prescribed norm. I had treated soldiers in my years of medical practice, who carried within them secrets far heavier than any wound, and I had learned to recognize the particular kind of suffering that comes not from what a man has done, but from what he is. But to hear it spoken aloud, in a solicitor's office, by a man of Deniston's measured propriety, this was something else entirely. Holmes, for his part, showed no visible reaction. He might have been hearing a report on the weather. "Mrs. Hartley has known this," he said. It was not a question. She has known, Deniston confirmed, since before their marriage. She loved him regardless. She considered it her duty and her privilege to provide him with the shelter of a conventional life. Their marriage, she says, was genuine, built on honesty between them, if not honesty with the world. "A remarkable woman," Holmes said, and there was in his voice a warmth that I rarely heard, not sentimentality, but a genuine recognition of human courage. "She is," Deniston agreed, "and she is determined to see justice done, though she understands perfectly well that the truth about her husband can never be made public. She is asking you, Mr. Holmes, to prove that Marcus Aylward killed Professor Hartley, and to do so in a way that does not require the revelation of the motive." Holmes was silent for a long time. He sat with his fingertips pressed together, his eyes half closed, and I knew that behind that impassive exterior, the machinery of his extraordinary mind was turning with a speed and precision that would have astounded any engineer. At last he opened his eyes and looked at Deniston with an expression that was, for Holmes, almost gentle. "Tell Mrs. Hartley that I will take the case, and tell her that I understand what she is asking, not merely to solve a murder, but to protect a man's memory. I will do my best to accomplish both." We left Deniston's office in silence and walked through Lincoln's Inn Fields in the direction of Holborn. The fog had thickened further, and the great plane trees in the square had become ghostly shapes, their bare branches like the fingers of something reaching blindly upward. Holmes walked with his head bowed, his hands deep in his coat pockets, and I matched his pace without speaking. Knowing that he was ordering his thoughts and would share them when he was ready, it was not until we were in a cab, rattling northward toward Bloomsbury, that he spoke. "The locked door is the key, Watson. Not because it proves murder or suicide, it proves neither, but because it tells us something about the killer's mind. If Aylward killed Hartley, he had to leave the room and lock the door behind him in such a way that it appeared to have been locked from within. This requires planning, which in turn requires motive and opportunity. The motive, if Mrs. Hartley's account is correct, is clear enough. Aylward feared exposure, feared the association, feared the destruction of his career. But the method interests me. How does one lock a door from the wrong side?" "There are many methods," I said. "I seem to recall a case involving a pair of pliers and a key turned from outside the door." "You recall it because you wrote about it with characteristic embellishment," Holmes said, but there was no sting in the remark. "Yes, there are mechanical methods, but they all leave traces, and I intend to examine that door with some care. There is also the question of the revolver. Whose was it? How did it come to be in the study? These are facts the police will have established, and I shall need to review their findings. You have contacts at Scotland Yard who might assist." "I have Lestrade who will assist because he has no choice, and because I have saved him from embarrassment so many times that he owes me a debt that cannot be repaid in a single lifetime. I sent him a wire before we left Baker Street." I should not have been surprised, but I was. Holmes's capacity to act upon a decision before he had apparently made it was one of his most disconcerting qualities. The Hartley residence was a handsome townhouse in one of the quieter squares of Bloomsbury, the kind of house that suggested comfort without ostentation, respectability without pretension. A low iron fence separated a small front garden from the pavement, and the door was painted a dark green that had faded, with time and weather, to something closer to the colour of old moss. A crape wreath hung upon it, a concession to mourning that seemed in its solitary blackness against the faded green, almost unbearably lonely. We were admitted by Mrs. Caldwell, the housekeeper, a stout woman of perhaps 55 with a face that bore the particular expression of someone who has been weeping regularly and is determined not to do so again. She led us through a narrow hallway lined with bookshelves. Even the hallway had bookshelves, their contents spilling over into precarious stacks on the floor and up a flight of stairs to the first-floor landing, where a single door stood closed at the end of a short corridor. "This is the study," Mrs. Caldwell said, and her voice caught on the word. She recovered herself quickly. "Mrs. Hartley asked me to give you full access. She said you were to examine anything you wished." "Mrs. Hartley is not at home?" Holmes asked. "She is resting, sir. The doctor has given her something to help her sleep. She has not slept properly since it happened." Holmes nodded. "I understand. We shall try not to disturb her. Tell me, Mrs. Caldwell, you were here on the evening of October the 7th. "I was, sir." "And you admitted Dr. Aylward?" "I did. He arrived at 7 o'clock, or just after. I showed him to the study. The professor was expecting him." "How did you know the professor was expecting him?" "He told me so earlier that day. He said Dr. Aylward would be coming round after dinner to discuss their work and that I was to bring up coffee at 7:30. "And did you?" "I did, sir. I brought the coffee at 7:30 as instructed." They were sitting together, the professor at his desk and Dr. Aylward in the armchair by the fire. They seemed quite comfortable. The professor was showing Dr. Aylward some papers. "Did you hear any of their conversation?" Mrs. Caldwell hesitated. "Not clearly, sir. When I knocked and entered with the tray, they stopped talking. But as I was setting the things down, I heard the professor say something about, I believe his exact words were, 'We must settle this between us, Marcus.' Dr. Aylward said something I didn't catch, and then the professor noticed me and asked if that would be all." "And after you left, did you hear anything further?" "I went downstairs to the kitchen. The study is directly above, and these old houses the sound carries, sir, if you're listening for it. I was not listening, mind you. But I did hear voices. They were raised at one point. Not shouting exactly, but louder than one would expect for a conversation about a publication." "What time was this?" "About 8 o'clock, I should say. Perhaps a few minutes before." "And then?" "Then I heard the front door close. That would have been 8:15 or thereabouts. I assumed Dr. Aylward had let himself out, as he sometimes did. He was a regular visitor, sir. He knew the house well." "Did you hear anything else after the front door closed? Any sound from the study?" Mrs. Caldwell's face tightened. "No, sir. Nothing at all. The house was very quiet. I thought the professor had gone back to his work. It was not unusual for him to work late into the evening. I did not think anything of it until Mrs. Hartley came home and found the door locked." Holmes thanked her with a courtesy that was, for him, unusually warm, and she left us at the study door. He turned the handle, the door opened freely now, the lock having been damaged when the police forced it, and we stepped inside. The room was large and lined, floor to ceiling, with books. Not the neat, decorative libraries one sometimes finds in the homes of wealthy men who regard books as furniture, but the working collection of a genuine scholar, volumes in half a dozen languages, many of them bristling with paper markers stacked too deep on shelves that sagged under their weight. A heavy oak desk occupied the center of the room, positioned to face the single large window that overlooked the square below. To the right of the desk, a fireplace with a carved marble surround held the remains of what had been, on that last evening, a modest fire. An armchair stood beside it. The chair in which Aylward had sat, I presumed, The walls that were not covered by bookshelves bore a collection of framed photographs and prints, mostly of archaeological sites, Pompeii, Athens, the ruins of Carthage. There was, I noticed, a single personal photograph on the desk, a picture of a young woman in the fashion of the 1860s, standing in a garden with a slight smile that suggested she had been caught in a moment of unguarded happiness. I assumed this was Eleanor Hartley, in the early years of their marriage. Holmes moved through the room with the slow, deliberate precision of a man mapping terrain. He examined the desk first, running his fingers along its surface, opening drawers, lifting papers and setting them down with care. He spent several minutes at the window studying the latch and the frame, and then moved to the fireplace, where he knelt and sifted through the ashes with a small tool he produced from his coat pocket. He examined the carpet, a heavy Persian rug, worn thin in places, with particular attention to the area around the desk and the armchair. He studied the door, both the lock mechanism and the frame, with an intensity that suggested he was reading a language written in wood and metal. I stood by the window and waited, watching him work with the familiar mixture of admiration and patience that his investigations always inspired in me. The square below was quiet. A nurse pushed a perambulator along the pavement, and a dog of indeterminate breed trotted purposefully in the opposite direction, as though it had an appointment it could not afford to miss. "Watson," Holmes said at last, straightening from his examination of the door. "Come here." I crossed the room and stood beside him. He pointed to the lock, a standard mortise lock, the kind found in thousands of London homes, operated by a heavy iron key. "The police found the key on the inside of the lock," he said. "The door was locked, the key was in the lock, and the window was latched from within, the classic conditions of the sealed room. But look here." He pointed to the keyhole, and I leaned closer. Around the brass plate that surrounded it, on the corridor side of the door, there were faint scratches barely visible, the sort of marks one might attribute to the normal wear of years, but arranged in a pattern that suggested something more deliberate. "Pliers," I ventured. "Possibly. Or a similar instrument. Someone has gripped this plate and twisted, or attempted to twist, the key from the outside. But that is not what interests me most." He knelt again and pointed to the floor just inside the door, where the carpet met the threshold. "Look at the gap beneath the door." I knelt beside him. The gap was narrow, perhaps 3/4 of an inch, but sufficient, in Holmes's estimation, for the passage of a length of string. "The method is simple and well known," Holmes said. "One ties a length of strong thread or thin cord to the bow of the key, passes the free end beneath the door, and pulls. If the key is positioned correctly, the pull rotates it in the lock. The door locks from the inside, and the cord is then drawn out from beneath the door. The only evidence is a slight displacement of the key's position. It may end up at an angle rather than perfectly horizontal, and the scratches left by the initial positioning of the cord around the key's bow." "Was the key found at an angle?" "I do not know. That is a question for Lestrade and the official report. But the scratches on the exterior plate suggest that someone attempted more than one method before settling on the cord technique. The first attempt, gripping and turning the key from outside through the keyhole, using some narrow instrument, was abandoned, likely because it proved too difficult with a heavy mortise key. The cord method was then employed. It is the work of a man who planned carefully but had to adapt his plan in the moment." He stood and moved to the desk, where he picked up the framed photograph of the young Mrs. Hartley. He studied it for a moment with an expression I could not quite read, something between curiosity and a kind of sober respect. 31 years, he said quietly. 31 years of a marriage built on a secret shared between two people, maintained with a discipline that most men could not sustain for a single month. And then a third person enters the equation, and the entire structure begins to crack. He set the photograph down and turned to me. "We must speak to Dr. Aylward, but first I want to see the revolver and the coroner's report. Let us find Lestrade." Inspector Lestrade was, as always, a study in barely concealed irritation. We found him at Scotland Yard, in his cramped office on the second floor, surrounded by the accumulated paperwork of a dozen ongoing investigations and wearing the expression of a man who has been asked to solve a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. He greeted Holmes with the grudging deference of long acquaintance and me with a nod that managed to be both friendly and dismissive. "Hartley," he said when Holmes raised the subject. "Yes, I know the case. Suicide, clean and simple. Gunshot to the right temple, powder burns consistent with close-range discharge, revolver in the deceased's hand, his own weapon, registered and licensed, kept in the top drawer of his desk. No signs of struggle, no signs of forced entry, door locked from the inside with the key in the lock. The coroner was satisfied. I was satisfied. What's your interest?" "My interest," Holmes said mildly, "is in the possibility that you are wrong." Lestrade's jaw tightened, but he had been through this particular dance too many times to rise to the bait. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that a locked door is not proof of suicide, that a revolver in a dead man's hand is not proof that he pulled the trigger, and that satisfaction, Inspector, is the enemy of truth." There followed a lengthy and occasionally terse exchange, during which Holmes extracted from Lestrade the details of the official investigation. The revolver was, as stated, Professor Hartley's own, a Webley, purchased some years ago when the professor had received threatening letters from a disgruntled former student. The threatening letters had come to nothing, but the revolver had remained in the desk drawer. It had been fired once. A single bullet had entered the right temple and lodged in the brain, causing instantaneous death. The angle of entry was consistent with a self-inflicted wound. There were powder burns on the professor's right hand. The position of the body in the chair suggested he had been seated at his desk at the time of death. "The key," Holmes said, "was it found at an angle in the lock, or perfectly horizontal?" Lestrade frowned. "I don't recall the exact position of the key, Mr. Holmes. It was in the lock. That's what matters." "On the contrary, Inspector, the exact position of the key may be the only thing that matters. Was there a police photographer at the scene?" There had been. Holmes requested the photographs, and after some bureaucratic reluctance, Lestrade produced them from a file. They were standard crime scene photographs, clinical, unflinching, devoid of artistry. I looked at them and felt, as I always did in such moments, the peculiar dissonance of seeing a human life reduced to evidence. Professor Hartley had been a handsome man in his way, tall, lean, with the kind of angular face that suggested both intellectual rigor and physical discipline. In the photographs, he was merely a body, slumped slightly to the left in his desk chair, his right arm hanging at his side with the revolver still loosely gripped in his fingers. His eyes were closed. There was, I noticed, an expression on his face that I would not have expected in a suicide, a look of something that might have been surprise. Holmes studied the photographs with minute attention, using a magnifying glass he had brought for the purpose. He spent a particularly long time on the image that showed the door and its lock. At last, he straightened and handed the photographs back to Lestrade. "The key is at an angle," he said, "approximately 15 degrees from horizontal, tilted to the right. This is inconsistent with a key that was turned by hand and left in place. A human hand, turning a key in a lock, naturally returns the key to a roughly horizontal position. The angle suggests the key was turned by some other means, a cord or thread pulled from beneath the door, for instance, which would rotate the key but lack the precision to return it to a natural resting position." Lestrade stared at him. You're basing a murder theory on 15 degrees? I am basing a hypothesis on 15 degrees, a set of scratches around the exterior keyhole plate, and the fact that a man who never locked his study door in 31 years of marriage is unlikely to have developed the habit on the evening of his death. I am also basing it on the expression on the dead man's face, which you will observe in photograph number 3. It is not the expression of a man who has resolved upon self-destruction. It is the expression of a man who has been taken by surprise. There was a long pause during which Lestrade and Holmes regarded each other with the particular intensity of men who have had this argument as many times before and will have it many times again. I'll look into it, Lestrade said at last, but I'm not reopening the case on the strength of a key angle and a facial expression, Mr. Holmes. Bring me something solid. Holmes did not reply. He merely smiled that thin, enigmatic smile that meant he already knew more than he was saying, and we left Scotland Yard with the gathering fog wrapping itself around us like a damp grey shawl. We found Dr. Marcus Aylward at King's College, in the Department of Classical Antiquities, where he occupied a small office adjacent to the one that had been Professor Hartley's. The contrast between the two spaces was immediately apparent, where Hartley's study at home had been a place of accumulated warmth and personality. Aylward's office was stark, orderly, and almost deliberately impersonal. The books were arranged with geometric precision. The desk was bare except for a single stack of papers, perfectly aligned. There were no photographs, no personal effects of any kind. It was the workspace of a man who wished to present himself as pure intellect, unburdened by the messiness of human attachment. Aylward himself was a striking figure, tall, slender, with dark hair swept back from a high forehead, and eyes of a pale, almost colourless grey that gave his face an unsettling quality, as though he were observing the world from behind a pane of frosted glass. He was handsome, in the way that certain academic men are handsome, a handsomeness born not of physical robustness but of sharpness, of angles and planes, of a face that seemed designed for thought rather than feeling. He received us with a courtesy that was correct without being warm and offered us chairs with the air of a man granting an audience. I expected someone would come eventually, he said, settling behind his desk with his hands folded before him. The widow, I presume, is not satisfied with the official verdict. You presume correctly, Holmes said. I wonder how you arrived at that presumption. Aylward's expression did not change. Because Eleanor Hartley is a woman of formidable conviction. She loved her husband deeply, and she cannot accept that he would take his own life. I understand her position. I do not agree with it. You believe it was suicide? I believe the evidence supports that conclusion. Edwin had been under considerable strain in recent months. His work on the Carthaginian inscriptions had reached a critical juncture, and there were professional pressures. A younger colleague at Oxford had published findings that contradicted several of Edwin's key theories. He took it very hard. He was a man who invested his entire identity in his scholarship. To have that scholarship challenged was, for him, an existential threat. Holmes listened to this with the careful attention of a man cataloguing not merely words, but the spaces between them, the hesitations, the emphasis, the tiny shifts in tone that betrayed the architecture of a carefully prepared account. You visited him on the evening of his death, Holmes said. I did. We had arranged to discuss the final revisions to our joint publication on Punic funerary practices. It was a routine meeting. We discussed the paper. We drank coffee. I left at approximately 8:15. How was the professor's mood when you left? Quiet. Distracted, perhaps, but not despairing. If I had thought for a moment that he intended to harm himself, I would never have left. Did you discuss anything other than the publication? There was, for the first time, a pause barely perceptible, but present. Aylward's pale eyes flickered, just for an instant towards the window, and then returned to Holmes's face. No, he said. We discussed only the publication. The housekeeper reports that voices were raised at approximately 8 o'clock, Holmes said, his tone conversational, almost idle. An odd occurrence in a routine discussion about Punic funerary practices. Another pause. Longer this time, I watched Aylward's hands still folded before him on the desk, and I saw the faintest whitening of the knuckles. We had a disagreement about the interpretation of a particular inscription, Aylward said. Academic discussions can become heated, Mr. Holmes. It is not unusual. Indeed, Holmes said. Tell me, Dr. Aylward, when you left the study that evening, was the door open or closed? Closed. I closed it behind me as I left. And was it locked? I don't know. I didn't try the handle. I simply pulled it shut and went downstairs. The key, was it in the lock when you left? I don't recall. I wasn't paying attention to the lock. I was thinking about our conversation. Holmes regarded him for a moment longer, and then smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who has found precisely what he was looking for. Thank you, Dr. Aylward. You have been most helpful. We left King's College and walked along the Strand in silence. The fog had begun to lift slightly, and pale shafts of late afternoon light broke through the grey canopy, illuminating the facades of buildings with a transient, almost apologetic warmth. I waited for Holmes to speak, but he seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the middle distance. He's lying, I said at last. Obviously, Holmes replied, but the question is not whether he is lying. The question is what he is lying about. A man may lie about many things, Watson, and not all lies are equal. Some lies conceal guilt, others conceal shame, and some lies are told not to protect oneself, but to protect the dead. I turned this over in my mind as we walked. You think he may be protecting Hartley's memory? I think it is possible. Consider, if Aylward and Hartley argued that evening about the true nature of their relationship, if Hartley confessed his feelings, or if Aylward discovered them, then Aylward has a powerful motive to conceal the subject of their conversation, regardless of whether he committed murder. To reveal the truth would be to expose Hartley to posthumous disgrace and to invite upon himself the kind of scrutiny that has destroyed better men than he. Then how do we determine whether his lies conceal murder or merely shame? Holmes stopped walking and turned to face me. There was in his expression something I had rarely seen, not uncertainty, exactly, but a kind of grave acknowledgement that the problem before him was not merely intellectual, but deeply, fundamentally human. We follow the evidence, Watson. We follow it wherever it leads, even if it leads somewhere we would rather not go. Over the next 3 days, Holmes conducted an investigation of extraordinary thoroughness. He returned to the Hartley residence twice more, on the second occasion bringing with him a set of fine instruments calipers, a magnifying loupe of exceptional power, and several lengths of cord of varying thickness with which he conducted a series of experiments on the study door. I assisted him in these experiments, which involved locking and unlocking the door by various methods, and comparing the resulting position of the key with the position documented in the police photographs. The results were conclusive. The only method that produced a key angle matching the photograph was the cord technique Holmes had described. A length of strong thread tied to the key's bow, passed beneath the door, and pulled from the corridor side. The key consistently came to rest at an angle of between 12 and 18 degrees from horizontal, depending on the thickness of the cord and the force applied. He also examined the ashes in the fireplace with painstaking care, using a small sieve and a pair of tweezers. Among the remnants of what had been a coal fire, he recovered several fragments of paper, not the heavy cream paper of the professor's correspondence, but thinner stock, the kind used for personal notes or memoranda. Most were too badly burned to be legible, but one fragment, approximately 2 inches square, bore a few words in what I recognized as Professor Hartley's handwriting. "Cannot continue this way. You must understand that what I feel—" Holmes placed this fragment in a small envelope and said nothing. He interviewed Mrs. Caldwell again, at length, pressing her for details about Dr. Aylward's visits over the preceding months. She described a pattern that was both consistent and revealing. Aylward had visited the professor at home approximately twice a week for the past 4 years, always in the evening and always by arrangement. The visits had become more frequent in the months before the professor's death, 3 or even 4 times a week. Mrs. Caldwell had noticed, she said, a change in the professor's demeanour during this period. He had become quieter, more withdrawn. He spent long hours in his study with the door closed, though never, she emphasised, locked. He ate less. He slept poorly. She had attributed these changes to the stress of his academic work. But in retrospect, she said, she wondered if something else had been troubling him. "Did you ever observe anything in the interactions between the professor and Dr. Aylward that struck you as unusual?" Holmes asked. Mrs. Caldwell considered this carefully. "I wouldn't say unusual, sir. They were always very proper with each other. Very formal, even. But there was, I don't know how to describe it, a sort of intensity. When they were together, the professor seemed more alive somehow, more present. And when Dr. Aylward left, the professor would sometimes sit in his study for hours afterward and not working, just sitting." Holmes also paid a visit to King's College, where he spoke with several of Hartley's academic colleagues. The portrait that emerged was consistent. Hartley had been a respected, even revered figure in his field, a man of absolute intellectual integrity, whose work on ancient Mediterranean civilizations had set the standard for a generation of scholars. He was described as reserved, courteous, and occasionally formidable in debate, but also as a man who kept the world at a certain distance. One colleague, an elderly professor of Greek who had known Hartley for 30 years, used a phrase that stayed with me. "Edwin was the most private man I have ever known. He gave generously of his intellect, but nothing of himself. It was as though there were a door at the centre of his being that was always, always closed." On the subject of Dr. Aylward, opinions were more divided. Some regarded him as a brilliant scholar and a worthy successor to Hartley's intellectual legacy. Others found him cold, ambitious, and insufficiently respectful of the traditions of the department. One junior lecturer, speaking with the indiscretion of youth, described Aylward as a man who knows exactly what he wants and does not care whom he tramples to get it. When pressed for specifics, the lecturer mentioned a dispute over authorship credit. Aylward had apparently published a paper that drew heavily on Hartley's unpublished research, crediting the professor only in a footnote. Hartley had said nothing publicly, but the incident had been noted. It was on the 3rd day that Holmes received a visit from a person I had not expected, Mrs. Eleanor Hartley herself. She arrived at Baker Street in the late afternoon, announced by Mrs. Hudson with the particular deference our landlady reserved for women of obvious quality. Mrs. Hartley was a woman in her early 60s, slight of build, with silver hair drawn back from a face that was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with conventional beauty and everything to do with character. Her eyes were dark and steady, her bearing upright, her manner composed with the kind of composure that costs everything and shows nothing. She wore black, of course, but she wore it as one wears armour, not to invite sympathy, but to declare a readiness for battle. Holmes offered her a chair, and she sat with a careful precision that spoke of deeply ingrained self-discipline. She declined tea. She looked at Holmes with an expression that was both searching and resolute, and when she spoke, her voice was low and clear, without tremor or hesitation. "Mr. Denniston has told me that you have taken the case, Mr. Holmes. I am grateful, but I have come because there are things I need to say to you directly, things that I could not bring myself to communicate through an intermediary." "I am listening, Mrs. Hartley." She was silent for a moment, gathering herself. It was not, I sensed, that she lacked the words, it was that the words she needed were ones she had never spoken aloud to a stranger, and the speaking of them required a kind of courage that was altogether different from the quiet fortitude she had displayed for 3 decades. "I loved my husband, Mr. Holmes. I loved him completely, and I loved him knowing everything. He told me the truth before we married, told me with a frankness and a terror that I have never forgotten. He said he understood if I wished to withdraw. He said he would not blame me. He said he had tried for years to change what he was, and that he had failed, and that the failure had nearly destroyed him." She paused. "I told him that I did not wish him to be other than he was. I told him that I would rather share a life with a man of courage and honesty than live a more conventional life with a man of lesser character. We married, and we were happy, I think, as two people can be when one of them carries a secret that the world would condemn." "And Dr. Aylward?" Holmes asked gently. Mrs. Hartley's composure faltered just for an instant. A shadow crossed her face, and not anger, I thought, but something closer to sorrow. "Marcus Aylward entered our lives 4 years ago. Edwin was captivated by him, by his intellect at first, and then by something deeper. I saw it happening. I saw the change in Edwin. He became lighter, somehow more alive, more present. It was as though a part of him that had been dormant for decades had suddenly awakened. I was glad for him, Mr. Holmes. I know how that must sound. But I had spent 30 years watching the man I loved deny himself the fullness of human feeling, and when I saw that joy in his eyes, I could not begrudge him." "Did you speak to him about it?" "Of course. We spoke about everything. He told me that he had developed a profound attachment to Marcus, and that he did not know whether it was reciprocated. He said he had resolved never to speak of it, never to act upon it, because to do so would be to place Marcus in an impossible position. But in recent months, in the weeks before his death, something changed. Edwin became agitated, distressed. He told me that Marcus had begun to suspect, that there had been moments of intimacy in their conversations that had gone further than Edwin intended, that Marcus had asked questions, that the pretense was becoming impossible to maintain." "Did he tell you what happened on the evening of October the 7th? "He could not tell me, Mr. Holmes. He was dead." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Mrs. Hartley sat very straight in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, and her dark eyes held Holmes's gaze with an intensity that was almost fierce. "But I know this," she continued. "I know that Edwin did not kill himself. I knew him. Mr. Holmes knew him better than any person alive. He was afraid? Yes. He was in anguish, but he was not a man who surrendered. He would have found another way. He would have sent Marcus away, resigned his position, left England if necessary. He would not have taken a revolver from his desk and put it to his temple. That is not who he was." Holmes regarded her in silence for a long moment, and I saw in his face something I had seen only a handful of times, a deep, quiet respect that bordered on reverence. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, "I believe you are right. I believe your husband was murdered, and I believe I can prove it. but I must warn you that the proof may require the examination of truths that you may find painful. I have lived with painful truths for 31 years, Mr. Holmes. I'm not afraid of them. After she left, Holmes sat for a long time in his chair by the fire, smoking his pipe and staring at the ceiling with the abstracted intensity that signaled deep thought. I sat opposite him and waited, as I had waited so many times before, for the moment when the threads would come together and the pattern would emerge. "Watson," he said at last, "there is something that has been troubling me about Dr. Aylward's account. He claims they discussed only the publication." Mrs. Caldwell heard raised voices. The burned paper fragments in the fireplace include what appears to be a personal confession from Hartley. If Hartley wrote that confession and showed it to Aylward, or if he spoke the words aloud, then Aylward's claim that they discussed only academic matters is a deliberate and significant lie. Which brings us back to the question of what the lie conceals. Precisely. But there is another element that I have not yet addressed. The revolver. It was kept in the top drawer of the desk, a fact known to anyone who regularly visited the study. If Aylward knew the revolver was there, he had the means at hand. If the conversation turned confrontational, if Hartley confessed his feelings, and Aylward reacted with revulsion, with panic, then the sequence of events becomes terribly clear. A moment of crisis, the revolver within reach, a man whose entire world is threatening to collapse around him. But which man? I asked, and the question surprised even me. You describe a moment of crisis, Holmes, but it could apply to either of them. Hartley facing the possibility of exposure and the loss of everything he valued, or Aylward facing the revelation of an association that could destroy his career. Holmes looked at me with something very close to admiration. Yes, Watson, that is exactly the question, and it is the question I intend to answer. The answer came, as Holmes's answers so often did, from an unexpected direction. On the morning of the fourth day, Holmes received a note from one of the network of street informants he maintained throughout London, the so-called Baker Street Irregulars, though by this time many of them were adults with families of their own, still loyal to the man who had given them purpose in their youth. The note directed Holmes to a pawnbroker's shop in Clerkenwell, where an item had been pledged the previous week that Holmes had apparently been seeking. We went together, Holmes and I, through the narrow, crowded streets of that busy neighbourhood, until we reached a small shop with a window display of miscellaneous objects, watches, rings, a battered violin, a pair of opera glasses that spoke of 100 small surrenders, 100 moments when need had overcome sentiment. The proprietor, a Mr. Sloane, was a wiry man with sharp eyes and the particular wariness of one who has learned to ask few questions and remember much. He produced from beneath his counter an item wrapped in brown paper. Holmes unwrapped it. It was a length of strong, thin cord, not ordinary string, but the kind of braided silk cord used for bookbinding, notable for its strength and its very narrow diameter. Attached to one end was a small loop, tied with a specific knot that Holmes examined with intense interest. "This was pledged by a young man," Holmes said to Sloane. It was not a question. "Tall fellow," Sloane confirmed. "Dark hair. Come in last Tuesday, the day after the inquest was reported in the papers. Pledged this along with a few other items, a pocket watch, a pair of cufflinks. Said he needed the money for travel." "Travel," Holmes repeated. "Did he say where?" "Abroad," was all he said. "Seemed in a hurry." Holmes examined the cord once more, turning the loop in his fingers. "This loop was designed to fit over the bow of a key," he said. "The knot is a slip knot. It tightens when pulled and can be released by pulling the free end. The cord is approximately 8 feet in length, which would allow sufficient reach from the corridor side of a door beneath the gap to a key in a lock at standard height." It is, in short, the precise instrument required to lock a door from the wrong side. "You think Aylward is preparing to flee?" I said. "I think he has been preparing to flee since the moment the inquest ruled suicide. He expected the matter to end there, but Mrs. Hartley's intervention has unsettled him. He knows that someone is asking questions, and he is making arrangements to be elsewhere when the answers arrive." We returned to Baker Street, and Holmes sent a series of urgent wires to Lestrade, to Denniston, and to a shipping agent in Tilbury whose name I did not recognize. Within hours, the responses confirmed what Holmes had suspected. Dr. Marcus Aylward had booked passage on a steamer departing for Alexandria in 2 days' time, under his own name, with a single trunk of personal effects. "Not the action of an innocent man," Holmes observed, "but also not the action of a man who has planned carefully. A true mastermind would have booked passage under a false name and departed weeks ago. Aylward is running, but he is running badly, hastily, impulsively, with the desperation of a man whose nerve has finally broken."
That evening, Holmes arranged a meeting. It took place not at Baker Street, but at the offices of Denniston, Price and Calloway, where the heavy oak panelling and the stern portrait of the firm's founder provided a suitable backdrop for what Holmes described, with characteristic understatement, as a conversation. Present were Holmes, myself, Inspector Lestrade, who had been persuaded somewhat grudgingly that the case merited reconsideration, and Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, who sat in a straight-backed chair with her hands folded and her dark eyes fixed on the door through which Dr. Aylward would shortly enter. Aylward arrived precisely on time, a fact that, in retrospect, seems characteristic of a man whose life was organized around the maintenance of appearances. He entered the room and stopped when he saw the assembled company. His face, already pale, lost what little color it possessed, and I saw his gaze move from face to face, Holmes, Lestrade, Denniston, and finally Mrs. Hartley, with the rapid calculation of a man assessing his position and finding it untenable. "Please sit down, Dr. Aylward," Holmes said in the tone of a man offering a chair at a dinner party. "We have a great deal to discuss." Aylward sat. His hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly, though he placed them flat on the table before him in what appeared to be a conscious effort at self-control. "You know why we are here," Holmes continued. "You know that I have been investigating the death of Professor Edwin Hartley. And you know, because you are an intelligent man, Dr. Aylward, whatever else you may be, that I have found enough to make your position extremely precarious." "I have nothing to say," Aylward said. His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of a wire drawn taut, one vibration away from breaking. "Then allow me to say it for you," Holmes replied. "On the evening of October the 7th, you visited Professor Hartley at his home. The visit was arranged in advance, ostensibly to discuss your joint publication. But the true purpose of the meeting was something else entirely. Professor Hartley had written you a letter, a personal confession of his feelings toward you. You had received this letter, and you had come to his home to discuss its contents." Aylward said nothing. His jaw tightened. The conversation became heated. The professor's confession, spoken aloud perhaps for the first time in his life, was met not with understanding, but with something far worse. You were not merely surprised, Dr. Aylward, you were horrified. Not because the confession was unwelcome, but because it named something you had spent your entire adult life refusing to acknowledge in yourself. The professor's truth was your truth as well, and you could not bear to hear it spoken. I watched Aylward's face as Holmes spoke, and what I saw there was not the expression of a man caught in a lie. It was the expression of a man being slowly, inexorably stripped of the armor he had worn for so long that he had forgotten it was armor at all. His pale eyes, usually so carefully blank, were alive with a terrible, unguarded anguish. In the struggle that followed, a struggle of words, not of fists, Professor Hartley showed you the letter he had written to himself, the confession found later by his wife. You read it. You understood. And in that moment of understanding, something broke inside you. The revolver was in the desk drawer. You knew it was there. You had seen it many times. In a moment of blind panic, not premeditated, not planned, but born of a terror so absolute that it overrode all reason, you took the revolver and you fired. The room was silent. Mrs. Hartley sat motionless, her face carved from stone. Immediately afterward, Holmes continued, his voice quiet and measured. The reality of what you had done struck you with full force. You burned the letters, the personal ones, the ones that spoke of feelings and confessions, in the fireplace. You placed the revolver in the professor's hand, positioning it to suggest suicide, and then you locked the door. You took a length of bookbinding cord from the professor's desk. He was a man who repaired his own volumes, and such cord was readily available, and you used it to turn the key from the corridor side, pulling it beneath the gap under the door. You left the house, closing the front door behind you, and you went home and began the process of convincing yourself that it had not happened, that the professor, despairing and alone, had taken his own life. Holmes paused. He reached into his coat pocket and produced the length of cord recovered from the pawnbroker's shop. You kept the cord. You should not have, but you did perhaps because disposing of it felt like an admission of guilt, and you were not yet ready for that admission. Later, when you learned that Mrs. Hartley had engaged me, you panicked. You pledged the cord at a pawnbroker's shop, along with other items, and you booked passage to Alexandria. But it was too late, Dr. Aylward. It has been too late since the moment you pulled that trigger. Aylward stared at the cord on the table. His trembling had become visible now, a fine, constant shaking that ran through his entire body. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He told me he loved me. The words hung in the air like the last note of a song played in an empty room. He told me he loved me, and I couldn't. I had spent my entire life making certain that no one would ever say those words to me, that no one would ever see what I was, and he saw it. He saw it all, and he said it aloud, and He stopped. His hands, still flat on the table, were shaking so violently that the wood vibrated beneath them. I did not mean to kill him. You must believe that. I did not go there intending to. I went there to tell him that it was impossible, that we could never speak of it again. But when he looked at me, with such openness, such courage, I felt as though the walls I had built around myself were being torn down, and behind those walls there was nothing. Nothing but the thing I had been hiding from since I was a boy. And the terror of it, the sheer annihilating terror of being known, I cannot explain it. I cannot make you understand. He looked at Mrs. Hartley then, and his face crumpled. He loved you too. He told me so. He said you were the bravest person he had ever known. He said you had given him a life he did not deserve. His voice broke. He deserved it. He deserved everything, and I took it from him. Mrs. Hartley did not speak. She looked at Marcus Aylward with an expression that I can only describe as one of infinite, unbearable compassion, the compassion of a woman who understood, perhaps better than anyone in that room, the particular agony of a life lived in hiding. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. She let them fall. Lestrade, to his credit, handled the arrest with a quiet dignity that surprised me. He spoke the formal words in a low voice, almost apologetically, and Aylward rose from his chair and submitted to the process with the hollow docility of a man for whom the worst has already happened. As he was led from the room, he paused at the door and turned back. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, "I am sorry, not for myself. I forfeited the right to self-pity in that room. But for him. I am sorry that the last thing he saw in the final moment of his life was the face of a coward. The door closed behind him. Mrs. Hartley sat in her chair, very still, and the silence that filled the room was of a kind I have encountered only rarely, the silence that follows not an ending, but a reckoning. Holmes and I walked home through the darkened streets of London, and the fog had returned in earnest, thick and cold and absolute, so that the gas lamps were reduced to dim halos of light suspended in the grey void. Holmes walked with his collar turned up and his hands in his pockets, and for a long time he said nothing at all. It was I who broke the silence, though I did not know when I began to speak what I intended to say. "Holmes, was it justice? What happened in that room?" He did not answer immediately. We walked on, our footsteps muffled by the fog, and the city around us seemed very far away, a place of distant sounds and indistinct shapes, as though the world itself were uncertain of its own existence. "Justice," Holmes said at last, "is a word that men use when they wish to feel that the universe operates according to comprehensible rules. Marcus Aylward will stand trial. He will almost certainly be convicted. The law will assign a name to what he did and a punishment to match. But the thing that drove him to it, the terror, the shame, the desperate lifelong denial of his own nature, the law has no name for that. The law does not recognize the crime that was committed against Marcus Aylward before he committed his crime against Edwin Hartley." "You feel sympathy for him?" "I feel understanding, Watson, which is not the same thing. Sympathy is an indulgence. Understanding is a discipline. I understand what Aylward is. I understand the forces that shaped him, the pressures that confined him, the impossible architecture of a life built on the suppression of fundamental truth. None of this excuses what he did. A man is still responsible for his actions, however broken the instrument of his will. But it explains it. An explanation, in my experience, is the closest thing to mercy that the intellect can offer." We reached Baker Street and climbed the stairs to our rooms. Mrs. Hudson had left a fire burning, and the warmth of it was welcome after the cold and the fog. Holmes settled into his chair and lit his pipe, and I sat opposite him and stared into the flames, and thought about Edwin Hartley, a man I had never met, whose life and death had unfolded according to a logic that was, in its terrible way, as precise and as pitiless as any of Holmes's deductions. He had loved. That was the simple, irreducible fact at the center of it all. He had loved in a way that his world would not permit, and he had built his life, his marriage, his career, his reputation as a structure designed to contain that love without expressing it. For 30 years, the structure had held. And then a young man with pale grey eyes had walked into his department, and the structure had begun to crack, and the love that had been so carefully contained had finally, fatally, broken free. I thought of Mrs. Hartley, her composure, her courage, her tears. She had known everything. She had carried the weight of her husband's secret alongside him, not out of obligation, but out of a love so capacious that it could encompass even the knowledge that she was not, could never be, the true object of his deepest feeling. She had loved him enough to give him shelter, and he had loved her enough to accept it. And together they had constructed a life that was, in its own strange and bittersweet way, genuinely good. And I thought of Marcus Aylward, sitting now in a cell at Scotland Yard, and I wondered whether the bars that held him were really so different from the bars he had built around himself, the bars of denial, of suppression, of the rigid, terrified refusal to know his own heart. He had killed a man. He would pay for it, but the prison he had inhabited before the killing, the prison of his own unacknowledged nature, that was a sentence no court had imposed and no pardon could lift. Holmes smoked his pipe in silence, and the fire crackled and popped, and outside the fog pressed against the windows like something alive and patient, waiting to be let in. "Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice quiet in the firelit room. "Yes?" "Do you remember what I asked you on the morning we received Deniston's letter, about a man who commits a crime out of a desperate desire to remain the person he believes himself to be?" "I remember." "I was wrong, or rather I was incomplete. Aylward did not kill Hartley to preserve his identity. He killed him because, for one unbearable moment, he saw his identity clearly, saw it as Hartley saw it, honestly and without disguise, and the sight of it was more than he could endure. The truth did not threaten who he was. The truth revealed who he was, and that revelation was the thing he could not survive." He fell silent, and the fire burned lower, and the fog held London in its grey embrace, and I sat with my friend in the quiet warmth of our rooms, and felt the weight of a sadness that had no remedy and no resolution, only the slow, patient acceptance that the world contains griefs too deep for understanding and too real to be denied. I have set this story down now, years later, because I believe it deserves to be remembered not as a triumph of detection, though Holmes's work was, as always, exemplary, but as a testament to the particular cruelty of a world that forces its inhabitants to choose between truth and survival. Edwin Hartley chose truth in the end, and it cost him his life. Marcus Aylward chose survival, and it cost him everything else. And Eleanor Hartley, who had chosen love from the very beginning, was left with nothing but the memory of a man who had been brave enough to show her who he really was. I think of her sometimes, in the quiet hours of the evening, when the light fades and the fire dies, and the world beyond my window grows soft and indistinct. I think of her sitting in that house in Bloomsbury, surrounded by her husband's books, his photographs, the accumulated evidence of a life that was, for all its secrecy, rich with meaning and purpose and a kind of defiant, stubborn grace. I hope she found peace. I am not certain she did. Peace, in my experience, is not the natural reward of courage. More often, it is the consolation of those who were never brave enough to need it. But I remember her face in that room, the tears, the composure, the fierce and unbreakable dignity. And I think that if there is any justice in this world beyond the imperfect justice of courts and laws, then Eleanor Hartley earned it. She earned it every day of her life, in every silence she kept, in every truth she held, in every morning she woke beside a man she loved and accepted, without complaint, that his heart was a country she could visit, but never inhabit. The truth changed everything. That is what Holmes said on the night we closed the case, and I have thought about those words many times since. The truth changed everything for Hartley, who spoke it and died, for Aylward, who heard it and killed, for Eleanor, who had always known it and was left, in the end, to carry it alone. But perhaps that is what truth does. Perhaps that is all truth ever does. It changes everything, and it heals nothing, and we are left to make what sense of it we can, in the quiet rooms of our own imperfect understanding, in the long and patient company of memory.